Thank you for joining California Competes' 10th anniversary interview series. Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon. Estela is the founder of the Center for Urban Education and a longtime professor. She also holds the title of University Professor at the University of Southern California, an honorary title given to a small number of professors in recognition for their multidisciplinary contributions. Estela retired from USC in December of 2020 and with several colleagues started a consulting practice that builds on racial equity, the racial equity work she led as director of the Center for Urban Education. She's published extensively, and her latest book with Tia Brown McNair and Lindsay Malcolm Picot, From Equity Talk to Equity Walk, is being widely read by faculty groups. Estela is an elected member of the National Academy of Education and is also an elected fellow of the American Education Research Association. Over her long career, she's held many leadership positions and currently is the chair of the Campaign for College Opportunity, one of our close partners. Estela, thank you for joining me today. The California Competes 10th anniversary interview series engages higher education and workforce development leaders around California's thorniest issues I know you've been influential in identifying and implementing solutions to. So for my first question, I would love to dig in and just jump in. You've been a champion for racial equity for decades. Where do you see progress being made in dismantling institutional racism? And what concerns you most about where we are today?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and congratulations on your 10th anniversary. What a great accomplishment. In terms of your question regarding, what kind of progress do I see? Yeah, I do see progress. I mean, when I started this work in around 2000, very few people were willing to speak about equity, and for sure not racial equity. They thought that often that the agenda that I was advancing could be divisive, that it would be perhaps more beneficial to focus on socioeconomic status rather than racial equity. And nowadays, equity is very much trending, and even much more so as a result of last summer's racial reckoning. So I do see progress in the willingness of people to speak about it more openly. The fact is that, for instance, Chancellor Oakley, even in the Vision for Success, the strategic plan for the community colleges, speaks about racial equity in his communications with college presidents, has urged them to take on the issues of systemic racism and inequality. I don't think that would have happened even 5 years ago. So I do see progress in more openness to speaking about it. I also see it among foundations that I work with. I do a lot of work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Postsecondary Success team, and they have been quite willing and forceful about being more intentional in addressing racial equity. So all of those things are good. I was recently working on ways in which one can differentiate organizations and their work in racial equity. And I think that there is still a lot of performative work, meaning that, people make statements about solidarity with Black Lives Matter or against police brutality, but their work doesn't always, reflect the sentiments of those kinds of statements. So this is all to say that we're seeing progress in people's willingness to talk about it, to disaggregate data by race and ethnicity. But I would say that we're still not at the point where there is a willingness to address how to decenter whiteness in the ways in which we do things, in the things that we value. And so we still have a way to go. I think that sometimes people confuse talking about equity, racial equity with action. And that's why the title of our book was From Equity Talk to Equity Walk.
Related to your last comment, in your work, you talk about the values of whiteness and the role they play in higher education. Can you break that down a little bit for us today?
Yes. So when I say whiteness, I'm not talking about white people. I'm talking more about whiteness, and this is not original to me. There are many others who have written about it from much deeper than I can probably speak about it. But it's about whiteness as a process, or whiteness as values, or even whiteness as a mental schema that impacts the ways in which we frame problems. So let me just give you some examples of that and how they might apply to higher education. There is a tendency for us, for instance, to speak about students in a universalist way. And that is the influence of whiteness as a kind of mental schema, in that we don't realize that when we speak about students in universal terms, the imagined student typically is a white student. We don't imagine a Black student. So when we do that, we forget or we leave out that the lived reality of a Black or a Latinx student is not the same as all students. So one of the things that I think that whiteness does, it tends to universalize experience and universalize identities. And that is why we continue to reproduce inequality. So that's one example that I just gave you. Another example, I think, of whiteness is we are about to release a report in which we analyzed the professional development opportunities for community college faculty around implementation of AB 705 and pathways. And our analysis of all of 15 webinar sessions, we found that they never really, they actually would say things like, well, pathways is an equity initiative, right? But in the content of the professional development sessions, racial inequity or racial equity or anti-racism, or how you create a classroom culture that affirms the identities of the majority of the students in the community colleges, was never mentioned. So in that report, we speak about the potential harms of racial illiteracy, and that we need to think about revamping professional development. So there, in that instance that I just described, the individuals planning and delivering the professional development, they thought about professional development or about teaching or about pathways or developmental education, again, in universalist terms. And therefore, did not take advantage of an opportunity here to educate faculty members and others on how classrooms or the advising center or the transfer center or the math tutoring center, how all of these places don't think of themselves in racialized terms, and because of that are not serving the students who use the community college as an entry point into higher education in ways that will help them be successful. And looking at the statistics on your wonderful dashboard underscores what I just said, because it shows it shows, for instance, 70%, over 70% of Latinx students going to community colleges, and maybe 60% for Blacks. but it also shows, Blacks going to the for-profit sector at twice I think the rate of other groups, which is very, very alarming. And so those are all that's what I mean by whiteness, is us being able to notice those things and to do something about them, and to not, and to teach ourselves how to think specifically about how will this policy, right? How will this policy impact Black students? How will it impact Latinx students? Not how will this policy impact all students?
Yeah, we talk about, higher ed so much as being a key to economic and social mobility, but in many ways, it is the institution that, maintains sort of our current status.
Yes, and the sense of, merit. I'm about to undertake a study of how college presidents are appointed in the three public sectors in California, and I have a research team that we will start to work in September. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is how the origins of one's degree, PhD, matters in the appointment of college presidents as you go up in the hierarchy, and how that the value that is attached to having PhDs from highly selective universities becomes maybe an impediment to diversifying the presidency. So I've been thinking a lot about some of these things.
You've had, this amazing career, having this amazing career, really, I feel like focusing on challenging norms and exposing inequities in higher ed. And I would love for you to talk about one of the things that is widely used in California higher ed, the equity scorecard. Can you tell us about what that is and how it came to be, and the impact you've seen it have in California?
The equity scorecard was something that I actually adapted from the business world. It was the balanced scorecard, and there was an article in the Harvard Business Review about the balanced scorecard, and it was about how you could choose metrics to show where progress, and how to show to your constituencies, your boards, and so forth. And all of the metrics obviously were about profit. And so I kind of took the framework and redid it to fit racial equity, so that there were like 4 areas in the scorecard. So I renamed them, and so that's how I started. But I'm not a scorecard kind of person. I use the scorecard because I knew that it would be attractive to higher education leaders to have something that had to do with metrics. And I felt that the scorecard itself as an artifact would provide an entry into conversations beyond, metrics. So the scorecard was both, an artifact for metrics, but it was also a medium. It mediated the engagement of faculty and staff in conversations that in many ways uncovered their, when they looked at the data, it uncovered their beliefs about Black and Latinx and Indigenous students that were very loaded with deficit, so that it revealed that the problem was not only in terms of the data, but that the problem was in how these students were viewed and in ways that were stigmatizing and alienating and discouraging. So this is all to say that that's how I started with the scorecard. But then I realized that it wasn't enough and that we had to develop new tools to engage faculty and staff in studying how they were part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And so the uniqueness of the scorecard are the methods that we use. So rather than being a consultant to institutions and telling them what they need to do, we actually created a way in which institutional actors, faculty and staff, could study their own practices through a racial equity lens. And it has been extremely effective because it put them in charge of their own, they became like anthropologists of their own practices.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the state budget that was just passed earlier this summer. The 2021-22 California state budget, it contributes significant funding to higher education initiatives and workforce training. And one of the things that we think is very exciting is that the Budget Act also aims to do so equitably, with some allocations being determined based off of the enrollment of Pell Grant recipients or the number of student parents enrolled. Do you think the state's on the right track to building an equitable recovery? And what more could be done to ensure an equitable recovery?
I would say, yes, that the money is important, but in order for money to be able to facilitate, equity, racial equity, and to actually address those problems that are shown so starkly in your dashboard, as well as in the work that we have done at the Campaign for College Opportunity, for instance, in terms of the implementation of AB 705, the associate degree in transfer. We're not going to get there unless we don't think of strategies to implement these policies and new practices in ways that are centered on how can we do AB 705, or how can we do the associate degree in transfer so that it benefits those with the greatest needs. I mean, that's what equity is about. Equity is not about distributing equally. It's about giving more to the ones in greatest needs. And that's my fear, that we have these great, potentially progressive policies, but that we don't always have the knowledge, the will, or the lever, the levers to deal with power, because this progressive policies sometimes feel threatening to people who have held power. And I see that happening with things like AB 705, for instance. So my fear is that we don't always think through how to not only create progressive policies, but how to implement them in ways that they attain those the promise of progressiveness that they have. And I'm seeing that.
What does that look like what is a campus that can, sort of grasp and run with and faithfully execute these policies look like? How do we nurture that?
I'm going to talk about the community colleges here because they play such an important role. But most of the faculty in the community colleges come from programs in the Cal State system, like master's programs, whether in math or in English. I mean, some of them come from doctoral programs as well, but they tend to be local. And so one way you can do that is by changing the curriculum of those master's programs in the Cal State system that prepare both teachers as well as faculty. I mean, that's one of the ways. And I I haven't taken a look at the curriculum of those master's programs, but I'm pretty sure that they don't address necessarily how do you teach math effectively and with excellence at LA Trade Tech College, for instance. So that's one of the ways. I think another way is that we need to recruit more faculty that look like the students in the colleges. So I have seen the difference in the teaching of Jennifer Ortiz, an English instructor who used to be at LA Trade Tech, but now is at Mission College, who grew up in the neighborhood. And so that she's able to create an environment in her classroom that is just so affirming, so engaging for her students. And we need more faculty like that. And I have many others that I could name. So that's part of the work. Another part of the work is to have college presidents who understand these issues and are willing to take the risks. So like Pam Luster at San Diego Mesa is one such person. Keith Curry at Compton Community College, at Compton College. Carolyn Goldsmith at Fresno City College. Joe Castro, now the chancellor of the Cal State University system. So we need more leaders who are not allergic to race talk.
Yeah. You talked about new knowledge, and you've referenced our California Competes Postsecondary Prosperity Dashboard a number of times, and I'm thrilled that you are using it. I wonder if
it's a great dashboard. I love it.
Thank you. We are in the process of updating it too, so we will have more and new data shortly.
You know what would be great if you could do? You know, the Asian category is problematic because when you look at it, it looks like they're way above on everything, right? Mm-hmm. But you know that that's not for everyone, right? That there are categories within that may look more like the Latino and Black and American Indian dashboard.
Yeah, so we do, where possible, break down the Asian and Latinx populations. So for Asian, you can see, Southeast Asian versus South Asian, and the outcomes are dramatically different. And for Latinx population, we also, when possible, we'll break that down. So you could look at outcomes for Cuban Californians versus Mexican Californians. And it's not surprisingly, when you disaggregate, it's dramatically different, which is I feel like so important in California because we have different populations in different regions. So Asian in Central Sierra or Sacramento Tahoe could be very different than Asian in the Bay Area or Imperial. That's
a great point. That those are kinds of the nuances that a lot of times we overlook because it's, we become too driven by the size, the N size, right?
Yep. Yep. I would love to also, so you mentioned that around sort of further disaggregating racial ethnic groups than what we typically see in quantitative research. Is there any other sort of knowledge that you think is really important for researchers and why it's important for us to think about, how we disaggregate and think about the folks that we're serving through our research?
Yeah, one of the things that bothers me that a lot of times people who don't understand the sociology, the history, the politics of race in the United States, that they often think that by disaggregating data, they're doing, quote unquote, equity work. And really, the data are important, but what's more important is the questions that are asked. And I find that a lot of people who are disaggregating data don't always know what questions to ask from a critical race perspective. And so, for instance, a lot of times you'll see people talking of comparing the outcomes of Blacks and whites, Latinx and whites, or with Asians. And that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it from a critical perspective is to ask, for instance, looking at your dashboard, why is it that A through G is serving white students so much better than it is serving Black students? So that way, the research question takes you to the institutional structures and practices, not to the students' competencies, which most programs in colleges and universities have been around the fixing of the student. It's, like they need more support, they need more compensatory forms. And yes, those are all important, but we also need to remediate institutional structures, institutional routines, because that's how racial inequity is committed. It's not committed by students and their culture or their parents or their their high schools. So what I'm saying is we don't know how to ask questions that are centered on the institutions. We seem to only ask questions that are centered on the students. We have to learn how to think about organizations as racialized. Most of our institutions of higher education at one time were predominantly white. And even though they may be now Hispanic serving or ANAPISIs, their routines and their practices and their culture are still often entrenched in their past, how they were, because the faculty a lot of times has not changed. So that's what I would say is most important, how to think of UCLA or Cal State at Long Beach or Long Beach City College as racialized organizations, meaning by racialized that they still tend to work much better for students who fit the norm, usually white students. And then why is that and how do we change it? That's the thing that most of our professional development services do not do. Most of our policies are not written from that perspective. We don't think about policies as having race, and just like we don't think of them as having gender, but they do. They are gendered and they are racialized.
That I so appreciate you saying that. I would be remiss not to put in a little plug. We have a report that accompanies our dashboard that has in it sort of like how to use the dashboard and sort of like how to ask questions around, what does this mean? Like, how did we produce these outcomes that I think I hope no one in California would feel good about. So
yeah, absolutely. And there are things in your dashboard that A through G that shows great inequalities is, I would say that the only way you can get to that is to actually peel the layers of how A through G works at, I don't know, Belmont High School, and how the way in which it is done, who does it, like who the teachers are, how the students are placed, all of that, that's the only way you're going to get to the root cause of why A through G works so much better for Asian American students than it does for Black students or Latino students or American. The data for American Indian students in your dashboard is really shocking.
That I feel like we don't talk enough about the Native American students. I think a lot of times
Absolutely.
because the data, the numbers were so small, and you said the power of the N. And so I think lots of times quantitative researchers will just drop the group or will put it together with another group as an other. But it is,
Yeah.
an opportunity that we need to seize and address.
No, absolutely. And we shouldn't worry about numbers. I always say, one matters. And if you can get one to succeed, it's one more.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're grateful for your longstanding commitment and leadership around racial equity. California, its students, higher education, our economy, our communities are better for it. And thank you for your continued work.
Thank you for inviting me. This was fun to talk with you.
When you and I first met, I don't know if you remember this, I was an Ash Lumina Fellow, a graduate student, and feeling the pressure that you had noted around the pressure to focus on socioeconomic status instead of issues of race. And so my dissertation ended up being focused on the impact of wealth on college access. But from our many conversations when I was a grad student, I did keep in interactions with race. So thank you for that. It was, I think, really pivotal for me to meet a scholar who encouraged the continued focus on issues of race in my research.
Yes, no, I'm glad you mentioned that, because actually I was trying to think about when was it that I met you. Again, congratulations on your 10th anniversary, and also congratulations to you from being that Ash Fellow to now being president of this very important organization, which is dear to my heart in many ways, because the founder, Bob Sharman, was I call him jokingly the father of the equity scorecard. He was my first funder for the scorecard.
Oh, wow. Yeah, Bob, our first executive director.